so happy to have Kenyon Farrow with us. Kenyon has been working as an organizer, communication strategist, and writer on issues at the intersection of HIV/AIDS, prisons, and homophobia. He was the former executive director of Queers for Economic Justice, and prior to this, Kenyon served as the National Public Education Director, building the visibility of progressive racial and economic justice issues as they pertain to the LGBT community. Kenyon was also a Policy Institute Fellow at the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, where he researched, wrote, and advocated for new approaches to the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Black gay men in the United States. He's a founding board member of FIERCE, and Kenyon is on the national organizing body for critical resistance. In addition to his political work, he's co-editor of Letters from Young Activists, Today's Rebels Speak Out, and the upcoming A New Queer Agenda. His work also appeared in Spirited, Affirming the Soul of Black, Lesbian, and Gay Identity. And this month, Kenyon was the first person to identify as queer to receive the honor of being named a Modern Black History Hero by BET, the Black Entertainment Television Network. And now we're honored to have Kenyon on our campus speaking to us about race and class issues in the LGBT movement. Please help me to welcome Kenyon Farrow.
So while I'm playing my jewelry in the microphone, I just want to thank rappers. I'm originally a Cleveland boy, so I'm just down the road in the West. There we go. All right. And what I'm going to talk about today is, kind of looking at race and class and the LGBT movement. And I think one of the reasons why I want to have this conversation is we are at a particular juncture in LGBT politics, right? If we think about currently, many of the what I call the four pillars of kind of mainstream LGBT politics as the sort of issues that folks have been advocating for the last 15, 20 years in particular are almost all one. Right? So, we just found out yesterday that the Justice Department is no longer going to fight in court the Defense of Marriage Act that was passed under Bill Clinton in 1996. The ban on gay service in the military is also about to be sort of officially undone. We passed the Matthew Shepard James Byrd Act in 2009, which added sexual orientation and gender identity to federal hate crimes statutes. And then the sort of last piece is the Employee Non-Discrimination Act, right? Which we'll figure out when folks get to that. But we're at this moment where those issues, and I'm going to talk more about those issues specifically and what I feel like are some problems from thinking about racial justice and economic justice as they pertain to LGBT folks. But just to sort of name that that piece of what has been kind of made the sort of gay agenda is in many ways soon to be sort of completed, and so I think it behooves us to be thinking strategically about what comes next, right? And what actually I would argue is work that has been happening over many, many years around racial justice, economic justice, where the LGBT community is concerned. Often we have to, think about it. I feel like I'm always having to kind of contend with, out in the world in many places, this idea that the gay community is will and grace, right? Other people have to kind of deal with, with that, or it's queer as folk, right? Or that it looks a particular kind of way, right? And what I usually sort of describe that as is, I always sort of joke, it's like well-fed, well-scrubbed, very, kind of gay and lesbian versions of John Reed and Leave It to Beaver kind of families, right? As the way in which the LGBT community as a whole is often constructed, and what often gets seen as the only sort of the issues that sort of segment of the community represents is the thing that represents everybody, right? So, so I partly I'm going to be talking about the history of sort of LGBT political movements and how we ended up in a situation where that has become the reality for how many people in the country sort of see LGBT politics and work. The way in which the right wing has actually used that image in the last 15, 20 years against the LGBT community in specific ways. And then thirdly, what are some other types of work that are happening around the country or things that we should be strategically thinking about as we talk about kind of LGBT politics. So many people, so I also want to say this too, so I want to also challenge the idea that, in 2008 we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion, right? Many people know about the Stonewall? Well, I'll talk about it in a minute if you don't, so no worries. At the same time that the 40th anniversary of Stonewall riots, in New York City were being, kind of commemorated, was the same year that the film Milk was, had been in the theaters, and when Sean Penn won the Best Actor award, and the screenwriter, who's an out-gay man, won, for Best Screenplay that year. Both of them in their speeches made very particular sort of claims around the year. This was the 40th anniversary of Stonewall, and this is what we sort of need to do for the LGBT community is to, kind of pass marriage equality for the whole community. And so I want to challenge this idea that, what happened at Stonewall and the work that followed in terms of organizing in the LGBT queer communities in the United States, that marriage equality is the natural sort of direct policy agenda that makes sense after Stonewall, right? That's how we often, heard about it in, just a couple of years ago around Stonewall. So, just to give a little bit of history related to, Stonewall. So, many people also hear as, the sort of rumor, those of us in the room who are sort of old enough or have read enough about Stonewall to sort of have heard these things or have read them in different places, that the Stonewall, riots that happened in June of 1969, in this little bar in New York City, happened because Judy Garland died that day, and those queens were pissed, right? It is true she died. But that's often have any people heard that before? Like that, it was Judy Garland's death that, those girls were like, we're not paying it anymore, and that was that. That is absurd, right? And I think actually discredits the actual political moment of what was happening in New York City and in other places around the country related to ways in which queer folks were being targeted by police and their spaces were being targeted. And some of this is very relevant today when we talk about gentrification, right? And I know that there are some even conversations here in Grand Rapids about gentrification happening in different communities and, poor, low income, and in communities of color being pushed out in different ways to quote unquote revitalize, different neighborhoods, right? Of which sometimes the kind of, wealthy white gay community is very much a part of. So what was happening in New York City in the 1960s, the mayor of New York City, Robert Wagner, in 1964 was lobbying for New York City to become the next host of the World's Fair, which I don't even know if the World's Fair still happens anymore. Well, I haven't heard about it, but anyway, it's, in this day and age, it's sort of like when cities are all lobbying for the Olympics to come. I mean, it had the same kind of, thing. It was going to bring all this attention and supposedly all this money, and attention to the city that got to host it. And so what Wagner decided to do was, in order to make the city look more appealing to the committee from the World's Fair that was coming to New York to judge whether it was an adequate city for New York, decided to clean up the streets, right? And so what he did was he told the NYPD, New York Police Department, to begin to use existing laws on the books to target certain communities to sort of clear people from public purview, right? And the West Village and Greenwich Village in New York City, at the time, and to some extent to this day, although that is being drastically removed as much as possible, but the village had been, had a history of, sort of artists, sort of bohemian folks doing lots of cultural work. It was one of the few neighborhoods in the city where actually various kinds of interracial or clubs and bars that catered to people of multiple races and weren't segregated in ways that we often don't talk about. The North, like places like New York City, right? It was still segregated in the 1960s in many respects. But the West Village was one of those sort of neighborhoods where there was sort of the ability for people to sort of mingle across race. And also where lots of LGBT queer folks hung out, right, in those neighborhoods. And some of them were some of those same artists, who spent time there. Many people, some of you may know James Baldwin, I hope you do. As a black gay writer who was writing from the 1950s until he died in the 1980s, wrote a lot about the West Village. His novel, Of a Country, takes place largely in the village and deals with, race and gender and sexuality amongst like this kind of crew of folks there. So in any case, so that was sort of the history of the West Village. And because of that, there were lots of either homeless and poor, LGBT queer folks who hung out along, amongst the streets and what have you in the West Village. And Stonewall was one of the main bars that folks frequented, right? And particularly from, kind of poor and working class. So anyway, what Robert Wagner, the mayor, decided to do was to use, one, to go after bars for their liquor licenses, and to sort of raid bars and clubs and challenge whether they had liquor licenses or whether they were up to date or whatever, or not. And if they proved that they didn't, or at least said that they didn't, they would shut them down. That was one of the ways to target. And then they also used an existing rule on the New York City law books about clothing. And if you were born a quote-unquote man or born a quote-unquote woman, the laws were such that you had to, at any given time in public, be wearing 2 out of 3 articles of clothing had to be clothing of your supposed appropriate gender, right? So, all the black gays you see in Atlanta right now rocking, stiletto heels with like what I'm wearing right now would probably go to jail in 1965, right? In the 1960s, because that was, one step beyond, right? So it was particularly targeting, trans and gender non-conforming folks who hung out in the West Village, and most of them black and brown. So, so that was the sort of strategy, and that was the reason why Stonewall as a bar kept being raided, right? Particularly targeting that community, and as it just so happened that night, the queers there said, "Bump this, we're not taking it anymore," and fought back. And then some folks locked themselves into the bar. More folks started to gather, or kind of as word spread, people started to come to Stonewall, and folks, pretty much shut it down and kept the police away for like 3 days, solid. So, and actually, the other piece that happened, like after Stonewall happened, the New York Police Department, all in conjunction with the FBI, and we know now from different records that have been released, that they thought that the Black Panther Party for self-defense and or the Weather Underground, right, mostly white radical, militant leftist organization, that one of those two organizations were behind the Stonewall riots happening, right? So there was a way in which, like, what happened at Stonewall was seen as part of a, like, really radical left, and was not seen as, like, a mainstream, oh, give us our rights, for marriage equality and what have you, kind of movement. It just wasn't seen that way. So I say that to say, when people make the claim, that what happened at Stonewall is directly, in the kind of political lineage of the kind of marriage equality movement, is false, right? I would argue. So I want to sort of name that particular historical moment. And there were certainly things that had happened in other parts of the country, right? There was the Compton cafeteria riots in San Francisco, happened in 1965, a few years before Stonewall, or what have you, but I just sort of want to name, Stonewall as kind of the moment we think about as like the kind of culmination of the modern, gay liberation, queer liberation movement, and lots of organizing happened post that. Go with me? All right. So what you see then after Stonewall, you have lots of, organizations beginning to formulate. One is, the Gay Liberation Front in New York City. Also STARS, which was an early, transgender rights organization, was founded by Sylvia Rivera. Many people may know about Sylvia Rivera's legacy. I happen to know Sylvia in the couple years before she died, almost 10 years ago. And also Marsha P. Johnson, who's a Black trans woman friend of Sylvia's, so on and so forth. So a lot of the sort of early work was focused from those sort of organizations on somewhat on decriminalization, issues of gay sex or queer sex or whatever, or homosexuality or whatever in general, targeting the DSM-4, DSM-3 at the time, right? Which is the book that psychiatrists use to diagnose mental illnesses, which, homosexuality was still included in that, and that was taken out because of a lot of activism in 1973. So a lot of the work was kind of like dealing with decriminalization stuff, and then also with police brutality. And the kind of constant sort of raiding of gay bars and queer spaces. Secondly, so just, kind of thinking about that in terms of history, and I'm going to bring this all around to a point, so follow. So by the 1980s, well, let me back up. Let me say this too. This is not to suggest that there weren't more mainstream sort of, homosexual advocacy kind of groups like the Medicine Society that were also around at the time who were much more kind of conservative in their political agenda, in that they actually, in many ways, helped advocate for the addition of the, kind of psychiatric diagnosis of homosexuality in the DSM-3, because it actually, in that way, it made homosexuality more sympathetic, right? If you could name it as a kind of psychological condition that people couldn't help, people saw it in some respects as more, they thought that would be actually a way to achieve, rights for gay people in that respect. So I just want to name it as a kind of, that also is part of an aspect of the movement that was happening, at around the same time. But certainly by the time you get to, so the late 70s, early 80s, right? And so 1980, we have the election of Ronald Reagan, who some people just celebrated his 100th anniversary of his birthday, his centennial, I was not one of those people celebrating, just to say. And we can talk more about why later, or I'll get into some of that now, in fact, and you'll probably figure it out. But Ronald Reagan becomes elected president in 1980, and is seen as the kind of the major electoral win of what at that time is a very sort of new neoconservative movement, right? Which had been happening pretty much since the 1950s, the new right. I'm going to talk more about this in the JQ presentation, but ways in which the new right and ultimately the neoconservative movement helped construct the civil rights movements and claims for racial justice by black liberation organizations and even more centrist civil rights organizations, by the American Indian movement, by the Chicano movement in the West Coast, by disability activism happening by the 1970s, by the kind of gay liberation stuff. They helped construct all or sort of talk about all of this social unrest in two ways. One as being representative, and in the feminist movement too, let me be also clear to name. They started to talk about all of these different social movements as representative of the destruction of not just of the American family, right, and basically of society, of the American society, right. And we still hear this rhetoric today that U.S. society is made up of family is the core institution of American society, right. Okay. But that so goes the logic, right? I'll get into more of that tonight. But that was the logic. And so they began to kind of construct these different social movements as actually an attack on, nuclear, patriarchal, heteronormative family structures, but also as crime, right? And particularly the work around race and racial justice as criminal, right? And so the kind of tough on crime rhetoric is born by the kind of new right in the 1950s. And begins to be, championed in the 1960s through Barry Goldwater and later Richard Nixon, using that as a rhetoric to run. And one of the interesting things in the early 1960s, Barry Goldwater wrote to Richard Nixon, who, in Barry Goldwater's credit, the first person using the tough on crime kind of language. He wrote to Richard Nixon and said, this tough on crime rhetoric is working and is getting like kind of middle class and suburban, sort of the new white suburban as a constituency and demographic in the U.S. It's really getting them riled up, even in places where there are no quote-unquote race problems, as he put it, right? So basically, even in places where there are no people of color, that language of tough on crime is registering as racialized in people's minds and creating certain kinds of racial fears about what people were seeing in terms of the different organizing and social political activism of the 1960s. And so that's where the tough on crime rhetoric kind of gets, exported, and we still are battling to this day. So that's kind of the birth of the sort of neoconservative movement. Ronald Reagan, who had been governor of California but becomes president, is elected under the same rubric of bringing back family values, right? And begins to use this whole narrative of the family as a way to actually talk through both, again, racial justice work, to say that a lot of the gains made, particularly by the feminist movement and gay liberation movements, was destroying American society, and uses that as a way to register votes with people who wanted to return to some simpler time in American history when, people were more oppressed. But, although they didn't say it that way. I'm saying it that way. So anyway, so Ronald Reagan is elected on that tide. And unfortunately, what was happening at the same time, we now know had been happening since the late 70s, but we didn't really have a name or was able to identify it until I think June 6th or June 7th of 1981, when the Centers of Disease Control released the first study of the quote-unquote gay cancer that was beginning to present itself in gay men in Miami, San Francisco, and New York City. I think it was the three places where, or New York, LA, and I think Miami were three places they initially were seeing what we now know as HIV. And so HIV, primarily because it at least is recognized in gay men first, although there's evidence that IV drug users had been dying by the dozens in South Bronx and in East Harlem in the 1970s and early 80s when nobody, was checking for them, right? And were further removed from, healthcare and institutions that way, so nobody was even looking, right, in that population of mostly black and Puerto Rican folks in the South Bronx and, what we call Spanish Harlem. In any case, HIV shows up, it's first recognized in gay men, and that actually, though Reagan doesn't say anything particularly about HIV until 1986, it still begins to have a certain kind of political resonance with the new right to suggest that, see, this kind of willy-nilly, free love and gay sex is actually causing death and destruction and is their own fault, right? And is God's, sort of divine order in taking care of the homosexual population, right? And in other populations deemed deviant, right? So later there was, the 4 H's, right? There was, homosexuals, well, hemophiliacs certainly had more sympathy. Haitians who had no sympathy, and in many ways the travel ban on HIV for immigrants, which we just lifted last year, was really set up because of Haiti, right, and Haitians, right? That was the original projection of HIV in terms of like a foreign body, were Haitians. So what was it? Hemophiliacs, homosexuals, Haitians, and what was the other fourth one? Folks? I don't know, another H. It'll come to me. But that was the construction. And so obviously the queer community starts to organize around the HIV/AIDS epidemic because so many people just were literally dying. I'm 36, so I was a very young kid when the epidemic first hit, but I remember when it was being first talked about. And remember some of the things that were happening. I mean, people wheeling their, sick and dying loved ones to the hospital and dumping them on the steps of the hospital and leaving. I remember even in my own church, my uncle's church, I grew up in, as in, I hate the stereotype, but kind of almost most black churches, the choir director, David. And that's right. Right. David, who was a black gay man, and his partner, who actually was a white gay man, his partner came to church every Sunday, sat in the front row. What's great is that my uncle and my aunt, the first lady, I don't ever remember saying anything about it. Actually, David's partner was sitting right next to my aunt most Sundays. But then in church functions, after Sunday service, I remember people kind of walking around. There was like big potlucks we would do, usually once a month or whatever. And so, when AIDS hit, I remember people kind of going around and talking to each other and saying hello and that kind of thing. But part of the message that was getting passed was naming what David and his partner brought, what food they brought, as if to say not to eat it, right? This is what was happening, right? People were really fearful, and what happened politically, a couple things. Certainly the queer community, which, like I said, had come from the queer politics at that point were left politics, right? And mostly, kind of left progressive to radical organizing. and focused, kind of around, multi-issues. What happened, I think, with HIV is, I think that certain factions of the gay community, I think, began to actually believe some of the narratives around, queer sex and gay sex and bathhouses and some of the commercial sex venues as the cause, and our own immorality as the cause of the AIDS epidemic, right? Number one. And the other thing that happened with AIDS, and even though we talk about ACT UP as really the kind of the organization that really kind of transformed the debate around AIDS in the U.S. and was, in many respects, though it had its problems, a radical organization. But what also happens to me with, I think, with AIDS is that because it was killing so many gay men in particular in the community and of a range of race and class backgrounds, it actually brought into LGBT advocacy and organizing work people who would have never been active in any kind of social movement whatsoever, right? Because of their class background and wealth and a range of things, were not at all connected to the work that was happening around police brutality in queer spaces, to queer violence, or violence against queers that was happening in the early 80s and 70s. And so that in and of itself, I think, began to change some of the rhetoric, some of the narratives, and some of the actual political organizations that come up out of AIDS, because of all the money involved, began to shift the politics of LGBT, what becomes sort of LGBT politics, right? So look at it this way. Many institutions that now exist that in places elsewhere people take for granted, like, say, the LA Community Center, right, in Los Angeles, right, a huge multi-million dollar, LGBT center, right, got a lot of its original money from gay men who knew that they were dying of AIDS, but who were from wealth, who then left the wealth to those fledgling institutions that used those endowments to grow, right? And that's true in a number of cities, a number of organizations I can name. And so, and in many organizations that come out of that, that period, come from that kind of wealth generation and created to advance a political agenda that was very different from what had been a very more grassroots and more radical sort of organizing project. So we have that beginning to formulate in the 1980s. The other thing that happened in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, was this, so where this idea that the gay community is wealthy and white and male with expendable income and no children, right, that I referenced in the beginning that we sort of talk about as will and grace and that kind of thing now. But that came from early sort of market research that new gay magazines were doing to prove to big corporations that they were worth investing their advertising dollars in, right? So if you're basing any kind of early surveys of the quote-unquote gay community on who reads The Advocate or Out, right? Or whatever magazines, right? Other ones that were genre, which I don't think is around anymore. But those kind of magazines that, propped up or were beginning to kind of expand their basis during that period, you're going to come up with surveys that are white, male, upper class, with expendable income as the reader base. And so that became some of the survey data that actually pointed to some kind of gay community. And so that was the narrative that some of those magazines and then ultimately some of the advocacy by some of the mainstream organizations began to use to promote itself as worthy of inclusion in various kinds of civil rights. Right? Y'all with me? Okay. So that's the sort of root of what becomes the Human Rights Campaign, of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, of Lamb's League, I mean, a range of some of the organizations that now exist, this is the kind of context in which they either start or begin to really kind of expand their reach, their base, and their power. Fast forward to 1992. Mentioned good old Bill Clinton in the beginning. Bill Clinton, who is the first president, really, to openly kind of target a gay community as an electoral base in many respects, right? Like, really, you know, is actively courting a gay vote, which largely had not been, certainly not part of a national kind of electoral politics conversation in terms of vote courting in 1992. And the political issue that he decides to sort of, you know, give to this community of voters and of funders, really, is what we're talking about, before we're talking about actual votes, the people donating money, welcome to American politics, is the lifting of the ban on gay serving in the military, right? And that's where, and, you know, so he becomes president, tries to enact that, it ultimately, you know, backfires, and they end up with this weird don't ask, don't tell kind of, you know, policy that's just strange. So that's where it comes from. I should also just note, right, that in the same Bill Clinton that, you know, kind of everybody loves is like the kind of global granddaddy, running around doing all this, you know, good AIDS work and whatever. And there's a lot that's good there, and a lot that I could talk about another time, perhaps, is just to kind of contextualize his campaign in other respects. So Bill Clinton was testing as soft on crime in electoral polls, right, in 92. And one of the things that he did to make himself look tough on crime was to very, you know, grandiose and ceremoniously go back home off the campaign trail to the state of Arkansas to preside, where he was governor, or had been governor, to basically sort of give the executive order to execute a black man who was on death row, whose, there's some questions about his innocence at this point, even then, and whose IQ level was so low that when he was being explained to what was going to happen, he said, and was given his sort of last meal, said, well, after it's over, and I'll save my dessert to have after it's over. Right, so his actual kind of mental capacity to understand what the death penalty meant, he didn't comprehend. But this is Bill Clinton goes and ceremoniously, you know, goes to preside over his execution. Right, good old Bill. So anyway, that's just a little kind of historical factoid you can carry around. Aside from the larger point. So anyway, so this is the kind of context, but I think it actually is a point to begin to think about the kind of political, what are the questions around sort of values of an LGBT sort of community or policy agenda that is willing to make those kind of concessions with political leaders who do things like that, right? That's a question. So this is, part of this is the kind of birth of where the kind of LGBT mainstream movement as we see it sort of arises. As I said, there's some factions of this that have earlier sort of roots. There have been marriage, you know, talk about marriage for gays and lesbians before, you know, 2003, and, you know, going back several decades, actually. But we begin to see with these new organizations, and organizations with new power, if not new organizations, begin to make political decisions about the agenda without grassroots, like debate, support, you know, a range of things, and come up with, you know, marriage equality, hate crimes legislation, don't ask, don't tell, lifting of that ban, and then, kind of non-discrimination in employment as, pretty much the founding kind of issues of the movement, right? And largely out of, with a couple different calculations in mind. One is, if we basically adopt these policies at the national level, that once they are instituted, it will, this argument has been made to my face, that, kind of rights and acceptance for LGBT folks in other ways will begin to also trickle down once we win these four, things, right? And that has been made, an argument made to my face about why this strategy and why these issues, right? And I would argue that that is not so and does not confer the same kind of, certainly acceptance for a range of different people. The argument I was making last fall when we were witnessing, 15 queer youth suicides in the span of a month, is that if that agenda was supposed to mean that everybody was supposed to feel so kind of accepted and warm and kind of included in some sort of queer community, then it is an utter failure by that measure, right? That's number one. Number two is, to use an example outside of the U.S., if we look at South Africa, right? And in 1994, when the South African Constitution, the new Constitution was passed to supposedly obliterate apartheid, at least in legal form, much like what we have here in the U.S. De facto, instead of de jure, racism and segregation and oppression, but was passed. And you hear a lot of queer folks sort of tout the South African Constitution as having, accepting gays and lesbians and accepting same-sex marriage within the constitutional framework. But when we look at Black South Africa, that hasn't trickled down into necessarily better conditions for queer folks in Black South Africa. First of all, the economic structures in South Africa didn't change, and so we understand marriage equality being partly about property and other kinds of assets and wealth that they transferred from one person to another, that is the kind of marital contract, right? And what a lot of policies, the 1,000 and how many other rights conferred under marriage, it was a lot about property, right? Well, if you don't have any property and we're actually legally structured from having any, marriage is not such a, doesn't mean so much, right? in that respect, right? And so it hasn't had those benefits, certainly for Black South Africans, because they still don't own, property in the nation. And quite frankly, is similar to the U.S., right? Why marriage rates are much lower amongst poor people and Black folks, right, in particular. Despite different aspirations to do that, which I think exist, but the actual impetus to do so, there's no economics incentive, because people don't own property, right? If you don't own property, it doesn't, the kind of legal protections of the marriage don't make a whole lot of sense. There's some other quote-unquote benefits around, I'll get into that another time, maybe in the Q&A, or other reasons why people want to do it. So anyway, so that to say that the race and class sort of dynamics of what we have now arrived at as the LGBT agenda looks a certain way because of the sort of history of how it, became constructed. Like I said, certainly there were the Medici Society and other organizations pre-Stonewall and pre-AIDS in the 1980s. But really what we see the sort of power and money and wealth and all the things that kind of have made up the kind of LGBT organizations that we see as the sort of mainstream movement, kind of have its roots in that period, and used the election of Bill Clinton to actually consolidate the power in Washington, D.C. to an unprecedented level. And that is how the actual sort of agenda itself got created. A few things about the agenda itself. I mean, I just said a little bit about marriage equality and the kind of race and class dynamics of who that benefits and who it doesn't, perhaps. But also, if we look at don't ask, don't tell, right, for instance, I wrote a piece that's on the Huffington Post about don't ask, don't tell, called "The Military Job is Not Economic Justice," which you can look up. But you know, to talk about it more specifically, so don't ask, don't tell gets lifted. Gays and lesbians are able to serve openly in the military at some point in the near future, I suppose. What I find problematic about that particular policy goal, people will say to me, well, but Kenyon, don't you think that, like, you know, it's good to just lift discrimination wherever it exists? And I'm like, well, you have to think about, like, what the institution is you're asking for inclusion into, right? And we're at a moment where the rest of the nation, I don't care if you're talking about far right to far left, and everybody in the middle is saying, get the hell out of Afghanistan and Iraq, right? I mean, you know, it's pretty unanimous across, and for different reasons, but across the political sort of landscape. But that is the national conversation, that we're spending way too much money and too many resources and sending too many people to die in some undefined war on terror that we have no idea the end of, right? You know, in one kind of framework. I have a different one, but that's kind of the national conversation. And to have kind of the LGBT movement be asking for inclusion into the military without questioning the actual political moment where the country is questioning the military. And quite frankly, at this point, because of the budget stuff, I mean, even the right-wingers are questioning the Defense Department's budget. Like that, you know, is like half of what we spend on anything in this country, basically. And to not be asking any questions about that. And in fact, the way don't ask, don't, the way well, I'll go back to the hate crimes piece. But let's just say that, right? So that's a kind of a moral and ethical question, right? That mainstream LGBT movement has not grappled with. Like, what's your sort of position on kind of war in the U.S. military and the military-industrial complex, right? That's a relevant question. And it's also, and it's specifically relevant not just because of inclusion into the military, but it's relevant also because there are queer people in Iraq, there are queer people in Afghanistan. They don't have the right to be free and live without violence of various sorts, right? And in fact, many people argue that, I mean, there's clear documented targeting of queer people in Iraq right now, right? Post Saddam's fall. I have been told by my ex-boyfriend, who's Egyptian, that Iraq at one point was the place where the gay boys went to party. It was like the San Francisco of Baghdad. It was like the San Francisco of the Middle East, because Saddam was one of the few secular rulers and clearly had lots of problems, right? I'm not trying to like big up Saddam in that respect, but he was secular, right? And so there was more sort of room to do stuff there, kind of, or had some sort of queer spaces, that after the first Gulf War, Saddam became kind of much more, used much more sort of fundamentalist kind of language and stuff to sort of solidify the different kind of Islamic factions in the country. And now that Saddam is gone, in the fight over who's going to run Iraq, the Shia or the Sunnis, the kind of fundamentalist Islamic stuff has risen to the forefront, and queer people are being targeted in the process of nation state making, right? And so this is the result of this war, and this is what we're kind of, so there's no sort of analysis from the LGBT movement about that, right, and the damages that are done there. That doesn't matter, right? It's like, you know, in 2001, or 2003, I think, when the war in Iraq started, or maybe it was Afghanistan in 2001, there's this sort of somewhat famous story of one of the bombs that was going to be dropped either on Iraq or Afghanistan, that some U.S. soldiers had written, you know, die, I think it was die Iraqi faggots or something like that, on the side of the bomb. Human Rights Campaign does a whole kind of campaign around the, you know, military soldiers using the word faggot, right? Does not question the bomb itself, right? perfectly okay, right? But was in a debate about, an argument with the military about the word faggot being kind of scrawled on the side of a huge bomb. This is the limitations of that kind of advocacy, right? And of that movement, if you ask me. Don't ask, don't tell. Set that aside. Hate crimes legislation. Similarly, we are at a point in history, the U.S. imprisons more people than any other country in the history of time. The U.S. is 5% of the world's population, and we imprison 25% of the, or we house 25% of the world's prisoners. Half of those 2.3 people are people of African descent. 70% of those prisoners are people of color totally. Despite our lack of, you consider, say for African Americans, we're only, 13, 14% of the U.S. population, and we are half of the prison population. And not because we commit more crimes, right? That has been disproven, despite what the right says. But we are targeted for criminalization more, so we are arrested more, we're convicted more, we're getting longer sentences, right? Same thing, Latinos, 14% of the U.S. population, like 25% of the prison population, I think is the number. Somewhere around here. So there's like, so we're talking about 70, and Native Americans, First Nations folks are jailed at a higher rate than anybody, right, at any given time. So this is the context, right, of the U.S. prison system. And there's no analysis or no sort of movement building work with lots of communities of color that are doing work around the criminalization of drug use and the war on drugs and how it's impacted our communities and poor communities in general. Folks who are doing work around the three, mandatory minimum laws, the 3 strikes laws that happen in different states around different issues or whatever. And secondly, that also what exists in the U.S. is that there are queer people in prison serving time for getting the better of a straight person who attacked them. And they were charged under hate crimes laws against a straight person. Silver Bear Law Project, a trans legal services organization in New York City, has documented cases of that around the country. Similarly, if you look at hate, because people say, well, Kenyon, you support the hate crimes that exist for, people of color or African Americans that were created in the 60s and 70s for, blah, blah. Well, let's take a look at it. So in South Carolina, for instance, there were anti-lynching laws that were put on the books in South Carolina in the 1930s. And, to obviously protect black folks from racist violence. Currently, those laws are being used in South Carolina to attach onto assault charges. So if 2, black kids jump another one or whatever, and they get charged with a felonious assault, the district attorneys are in some cases attaching hate crimes, anti-lynching hate crime statutes onto those statutes, which carry a 7-year minimum penalty. So if you understand that the racial disparity and I would say, the kind of racist nature of the prison system, right, it is what it is, then the laws that exist within it are going to actually disproportionately target people of color, right? I argue prisons are homophobic institutions, and we will not solve homophobia by locking people up into homophobic institutions. That doesn't make any sense, right? Those are things that we have to consider. Lastly, I'll say about the Employee Non-Discrimination Act. I mean, I think this is the part of the sort of mainstream agenda that I find the least sort of gross. But it has its limitations, right? Clearly, like 30 states out of 50, I think, it's still legal to discriminate against people because they're, LGBT. In more states because folks are transgender. Some states that have sexual orientation protection and some that don't have any for transgender folks, like New York State where I live. So clearly, right, I support people not being discriminated against in employment and housing and a range of other things. However, it in and of itself is not will not deal with structural ways in which queer folks, especially low-income folks and queer folks who are gender non-conforming folks of color, are barred from employment and all the informal ways that happen. So there was a study done a few years ago where, you know, they used mostly black folks with resumes, where they had on one resume sort of ethnic sounding name, Rashawn Jones versus John Jones, or, you know, Tanika Watkins versus, right, whatever, right, something more sort of Anglo-sounding. Sent those job descriptions sent those resumes into a range of different companies across the U.S., and the more Anglo-sounding names, although it was the exact same resume, got the calls, right, got called back for interviews, despite the same qualifications, right? That's an informal way that, like, discrimination happens. And if you're a transgender woman with the name Tanika Watkins, right, like, you're going to be blocked, right, or more likely not get that job, right, because of the discrimination that happens. Secondly, we certainly know with the kind of EEOC processes of filing different kinds of discrimination, whether based on race, gender, religious affiliation, what have you, the number of those that actually get kind of taken up, right, that actually have legal damages attached to them are like so minuscule compared to the numbers of ones that get filed, right? And so that in and of itself is not going to solve like the problem of how like queer folks are like kind of strategically barred or in formal ways barred from various kinds of employment, right? Like, yes, we support employee non-discrimination, but it's not a panacea for economic justice. And to give you another example of Human Rights Campaign and its sort of thinking along these lines, the current Employee Non-Discrimination Act, I think it was in 2005, the Human Rights Campaign came up, talked to leaders of the labor movement, different labor unions, and said, hey, we want to pass this, Employee Non-Discrimination Act sometime in the near future. Get down with it, right? And the labor union said, sure. We also have this Employee Free Choice Act that we're going to be trying to pass in the upcoming year. Are you going to, you should support that, right? Now, to tell you about the Employee Free Choice Act, so that was an act which has been stalled in Congress since 2008 that would have basically allowed workers to unionize in states that currently have this right-to-work framework, which is mostly the southern states. And we can talk about why in a minute. Although, what was it, Indiana that just tried to pass right-to-work legislation, which basically means that, it makes it really difficult for unions to organize workers in those states. So when you look at many of the same states that have the quote-unquote right-to-work laws on the books, where there are almost no unions present, or very few unions present, those are also most of the states that also have actively okay to discriminate against queer folks, right, in employment and other public, public venues. And if we consider, like, people who are unionized, have access to better health care, they have higher wages, the different sort of benefits that come under unionization, and a union is, often, it's not always perfect, but often themselves are places that are easier for LGBT folks to begin to organize themselves within those structures or kind of be a part of those institutions in ways where their outing is meaningful and what have you. It makes sense to pass the Employee Free Choice Act, right, as it relates to queer workers, especially in a lot of the southern states or states where it's still legally okay to discriminate against them. So Human Rights Campaign has a business council, right, and it's an advisory group of, LGBT folks who work in some of the largest multinational corporations in the globe. AT&T, IBM, Boeing, I think it's not even Boeing, this business council tried to get HRC to not endorse the Employee Free Choice Act. Why? Because they're corporate multinationals who don't like unions, right? So And these are gay and lesbian people at the Human Rights Campaign, right, who tried to make that happen. Now, what happened is HRC got called out for it by the out at work, or private work folks out in San Francisco, and so they were publicly embarrassed for it. So they ended up endorsing the Employee Free Choice Act, but you will find it nowhere on their website. Now, if you go to the websites for Employee Free Choice Act and look, you'll see the list of institutions that endorsed it. You'll see Human Rights Campaign, but if you look the vice versa, and on HRC's website, Employee Free Choice Act will show up nowhere, right? And at this point, I know for a fact that the unions are really pissed with them, right? And so are many other institutions and organizations like them. Because folks feel like they only come out when they want something done for them, and then don't show up when it's important for other organizations or other communities. I've had conversations with people, the former ED of the National Organization for Women in New Jersey, black woman who's fed up with working with the equality organizations for the same thing. Totally queer friendly. That's not her issue. She will show up for queer stuff. But, you know, when she felt like she would ask them to do something for her, like they would wouldn't be seen. Unless there was a camera present, right? And then they could take some public credit. So those are like the politics, right? And how they sort of function, and how they actually don't consider much, kind of race and class dynamics, so they just actively avoid them, right? Or actively don't care, right? In many respects. And that's sort of the movement that has sort of emerged as what, people think of as the LGBT movement. Now, two last things, and then we'll open it up for questions. There are issues, because people always like, oh, Kenyon, you just complain, but what are your solutions? What are the, and I'm not such a, kind of wrap it up in a pretty bow kind of girl. That's not really my thing so much. But if, you're the solutions-oriented kind of person, like, there's some clear examples to me of what exists as kind of national policy issues or ways in which the LGBT community could work in better concert with movements and other issues that are happening, right? Healthcare reform was a prime example, right? One, I would argue we should have universal single-payer health insurance where there's no, insurer deciding, your fate, basically, which is what currently happens. And believe it or not, just one example, very naysayers move. My mother needs to have surgery on both of her knees. She works for a cardiology center, a healthcare center, where she, her job is to make sure that the physicians there have all their licenses and documents. They go to make sure their trainings are all in place so that they stay accredited. They have a 70-30 healthcare plan, right? Institution pays 70, you pay 30%. Her portion to get her needs done would cost like $12,000, which she can't afford. My mother will be 60 in April, and is basically saying, I just have to wait until I get Medicare at 65, right? Because she can't afford it, right? So, that's what we're talking about, if anyone disagrees. But let's suggest that, right, so employer-based, a system that has an employer-based healthcare system, right, also a system where those sort of employer benefits are also conferred through marriage, right, is a system that's going to mean that lots of queer people don't have access to healthcare, right, because they can't get married, or they don't, or because of other kinds of employment discrimination against queer folks, they don't have jobs anyway where they either are going to get health care or where they have, some kind of like partner benefits. So when the healthcare reform debate was happening, most of the LGBT national organizations were doing absolutely nothing about it, right? And there's actual data, like 25% of LGBT youth don't have health insurance. I mean, there's data around this stuff. Medicaid and Medicare are the largest insurers of people with HIV/AIDS. And AIDS still very much impacts the queer community. And you have to have an AIDS, in order to get Medicaid, you have to have an AIDS diagnosis, right? Which means that you have to be so sick and have your T-cell count so low that you get at least 2 opportunistic infections in order to get Medicaid, right? And then you have to do a spin down on any kind of like wealth you have, like if you have any wealth to start with, right? So you also have to like be, kind of take a vow of poverty essentially, and also, get so sick at some point that you can get access to Medicaid, right, in order to get it if you have HIV, right, and don't have employer-based health insurance, or you live in a state where you can be denied health insurance because of your HIV status. Although that's changed this year, some of the health care reforms that we did. Right, clear-cut issue that makes sense to the queer community. Do you get any emails from HRC or the task force or Land Legal or anybody else for, why we need to be at least advocating for the public option in 2009? Didn't happen, right? And, there's a range of other issues, but I'll use that as one because there's a clear kind of concern. I'll say one other one. I mentioned the suicides that were happening back in the fall. And we, at the same time, there was all this debate about education reform in the country, right? And also in the context of this conversation about, bullying and whatever. And some of that I don't like so much, because I feel like it's like it ultimately kind of criminalizes, the quote-unquote bully, right? And I think that's complicated and what have you, but that was a perfect time, I think, while the country was talking about education reform, and that film about Waiting for Superman, I think, and that's kind of what was kind of made all across the country, a debate, while at the same time these suicides are happening. I mean, that was a perfect place to, like, be talking about the education system and safety issues, curriculum, comprehensive sex education. You could cut it a million different ways, right? How it impacts LGBT folks. That didn't happen. The best you got from most organizations was using the sort of bully thing as like as a suicide job, as like a fundraising gig, right? Like, I mean, and that was crass, but that's kind of what I saw. So I'll close there with like just some thoughts about like what often gets talked about as like the Stonewall and what the sort of movement started out as, and what we have now as sort of a mainstream agenda as like the natural thing that, kind of has come in its place. And I would argue that a lot of the issues that Stonewall sort of started from haven't been resolved, right? Police have been raiding bars in Dallas and Fort Worth last year. The Chi-Chi's, the last black and Latino queer bar on Christopher Street was closed after 1 million police raids. The police tried to get the owners to sign a decree that they would not allow drug dealing in the bar. And I was actually in the court. I sat in the court during this hearing, and the owner, I was so happy he said this. He said, show me a bar in New York City where it's not drug dealing, right? And make everybody sign a pledge, right? Because it's not gonna, that's ridiculous. But they were closed, ultimately, leaving only 2 black-owned queer bars in the whole city of New York City. The other one closed about 6 months before Chi-Chi's in Brooklyn. So that's to say that the issues that Stonewall started as have not been resolved, right? And that the idea that somehow this sort of, marriage equality and, military service and these other things are the natural replacements of it, I think represent a really sort of kind of classist and like elitist and really quite frankly racist formulation of what it means to be queer in the U.S. So thank you for listening, and I'll open it up for questions.
Hi, thank you so much. And I wanted to ask you if you can talk a little bit more about your work with critical resistance and how we can get involved in anti-racist, anti-capitalist groups that don't adhere to the prison industrial complex, the nonprofit industrial complex. I find it hard to, because they're not mainstream, I find it hard to get involved or find those groups at all in my community. So.
Sure. Well, I think, so to talk about my work with critical resistance, I was the first Southern Region coordinator for the organization. I lived in New Orleans for a period of time and helped establish the Southern chapters. And critical resistance, for folks who don't know, is an organization that, it's a sort of a national organization that has local chapters in about 10 cities that are working on issues around what we call the prison industrial complex, and come from a position that is considered abolitionist, that there's not it's not a prison reform to make the institution of prisons and policing and surveillance sort of better cages, right? I mean, it's really the formulation that we actually need to think very differently about how forms of violence and harm happen, their root causes, and find solutions that solve them, and not just try to hoard people into cages to solve a range of different social problems, which are really actually not about anything but caging people, right? And just to say, if that's a kind of stretch for you politically, to just name that, we'll be talking a little bit more about this tonight, but to kind of get into it now, the 13th Amendment, which we think of as abolishing slavery, and I don't have the exact language in front of me, but basically says, yeah, you can't enslave people for no money to make them work, except for prisons, right? And we see and there are books written about this. Angela Davis, who people may know as sort of an iconic activist, whatever, is also a very well-known and very smart prison scholar. Her book, Our Prisons Obsolete, traces this history really well of the end of slavery, of chattel slavery in the U.S., and the expansion of prisons to actually capture black folks, and mostly black men, to pick cotton and do the kind of labor in the South that rebuilt the Southern economy after it was destroyed, at the end of chattel slavery. And so what we had, and then we have all sorts of laws that criminalize that population that are really about that, and are not about any other sort of solution. But the prison system is really an outgrowth of chattel slavery as it exists in the U.S. currently. So that's the politics of the organization. I think that actually there doesn't have to be a CR chapter here or some other place in terms of thinking about it. You're interested in issues around criminalization and prison expansion, what have you, to kind of do work locally that is looking at those things. The questions I would be asking, and I don't know about Michigan as much, but working about this area, but like, okay, how do you see, are there local ordinances that are in, ways that are about supposedly like, revitalizing communities that are actually building up more police in the community, right? Which is usually what happens to displace people so that gentrification can happen. That happens in city after city. That like they put in 100, like in New York City, in almost every neighborhood is gentrified, they put 100 new cops on the street. Like you can't walk, neighborhood I used to live in, you can't walk 2 blocks without encountering police standing everywhere, right? So I would be asking those questions. What does the state look like in terms of where prisons are physically located, right? And in most places around the country, they're located mostly in rural communities where folks from the urban centers, mostly poor people and people of color, are locked up. And then those people are counted as residents of that rural community. So therefore, that increases their kind of funding from the state and the federal government. They get access to more kind of congressional seats than if those people were counted in the communities they actually come from. And that perpetuates and it's not to say that like a lot of rural communities in the U.S. are, flooded with cash, but it was the compromise a lot of rural places made in order to sustain some kind of job growth when industry cut out, right? So instead of being able to go work at the local factory, right, and make, $25,000, $30,000 an hour with health insurance or whatever, your option is to work at the local prison as a guard. I mean, that's been the kind of the structural way prisons have, been situated in the U.S. economy. So those issues exist everywhere, and are pretty, I don't say they're exactly the same, but it looks mostly the same. And so there's work that can be done in local places, even if there isn't like a critical resistance chapter that's kind of needed.
You're absolutely spot on in regards to the prison analogy and stuff. I had worked for the state of California for the Department of Corrections, and you put it beautifully. One of the questions that I had was the comment that you had made in regard to hate crime issues. And one of my biggest pet peeves regarding hate crime issues is that there has to be that word present, such as if an LGBT individual were beat up, harassed, or God forbid, killed, that end all be all, but did you hear a disparaging term used prior to? Can you touch on that, and maybe how can that be changed?
Right, yeah, so, I mean, this is the other problem with the hate crimes piece, that even if you believe in kind of hate crimes frameworks to deal with, you know, violence that happens to people that's targeted because of their, you know, racial, ethnic, religious, class, or gender or sexuality, they're right, the way in which, like, to actually calculate that is so ridiculous, right? Because it comes down to often, like, was some particular epithet used, was some particular, and it is hard, and there are cases where that is also harder to classify, where there are multiple things happening, right? Where there's, you know, I mean, there's a case in New York where this black gay man was murdered by these, like, 4 or 5, like, white teens who had, he was gay, was, you know, they had this whole game where they, like, went on some, like, kind of gay website or whatever. He was supposed to meet up with one of them to hook up or whatever, that was the gay, and then they jumped him and killed him, right? And there's a way in which, like, I mean, given New York City's history with that kind of, like, attacks of black folks in some of those same, I mean, this happened, I think, in Howard Beach or Bensonhurst, and one of the neighborhoods that has been consistently, like, troubled with, like, racial attacks against people of color for the last 30 years. How do you, what, how do you classify it? Was that race? Was that the sexuality piece? Because, I mean, you know, it's how do you, it's hard to sort of can't tell in every case, like, one thing that sort of led. And I know that there are cases where that is actually, it was, the cases were sort of thrown out. They were, or there was no kind of hate crime because they couldn't classify it in kind of one particular way. And so it speaks to a way in which, like, our legal system, like, can't hold two thoughts in its head, right? That there can't be, you know, race and class and gender and, or a range of ability, a range of things that could be playing out in how violence happens, right? And so I would say that, like, I don't think that the prison system is, like, the solution to it, but it's, like, also very clear that, like, even in the way that the hate crimes work tries to categorize things, don't always fall out and so, like, you know, easy. And then another piece of it too is that you know, it also comes down to also, like, kind of victims of hate crimes that people care about. Because, like, so another example in New York City that happened a few years ago, these 7, like, black lesbians who are from Newark, New Jersey, you know, which is thought of as, you know, the way, like, people out here would think about Detroit, right, as, like, violent and black and all this, you know, all the kind of shit that people kind of put on Detroit, right? Like, that Newark is like that in the East Coast. So they're from Newark. They were in New York City, in the West Village one night hanging out, and some dude, you know, said something to one of them. They responded. He attacked one of the young women. He got stabbed in the process, did die, but got some flesh wound, basically. 4 of the 7 were imprisoned and they ranged from age of 17 to 25, I think, the young women. And they were charged with felonious assault. They weren't charged with hate crimes, although their lawyer, the guy's lawyer, was trying to push for hate crimes against a straight person as the legal framework. So they were charged with like 5 years to 11 year sentences. I think the last one got out last year. She ended up doing like 4 years with a whole legal campaign to get them out. And what's interesting is that the gay press in New York City was just as bad as the New York Post, which is like Rupert Murdoch's, Fox News channel. But this is his local newspaper in New York City, the Post. It's just as like horrible. But the New York Blade, the gay paper, they both papers. I think the Post called them. It was like, I mean, I know you don't want to laugh because it's ridiculous. Attack of the Killer Lesbians. It was. They were a gang all of a sudden. The gay paper called them a gang too, right? And there was an editorial written by the editor-in-chief that was like, we shouldn't be advocating, gang or, retribution type violence, and I thought to myself, and I think I might have blogged about it too, was like, if that had been Matthew Shepard who had gotten the better of his attackers, he'd be a fucking hero. Right, to be quite frank, right? So there's also a way in which, like, if hate crimes, like, you have to also be, like, a body that the, like, larger society values in order for people to even care that something violent happened to you.
Isn't that where the term development mafia came from?
I think that actually came from, but around the same time, and this is an interesting way in which, like, kind of queer, black, and brown youth are being criminalized. That I think that came from a Washington Post story about supposed gay gangs in Washington, D.C. I think that's where that was, but it was around the same time, I forget which. But, yeah. How about you? Okay.
Thanks for your patience.
I just had a quick question, just to touch on what you were saying as far as like economic and class justice. How is that to be really achieved if LGBT organizations are kind of like the human rights campaign, where they only touch with LGBT of color when they want backing for a specific issue? Like, it's not all inclusive, and it seems like everything on the forefront of the LGBT movement is sponsored by rich, white, gay, LGBT people or whatnot. So is it really, can we really get the full economic equality, social justice, if we're not all inclusive with all LGBT color, like along the rainbow spectrum?
Good question. I actually think, I always say to people, it's a lot of what I'm talking about here, I have actually said to those national organizations to their faces, their range of ways. They all know what I think. They don't like it, but they know. But in terms of what I won't do to their faces, give them what I think are the solutions, because I actually just don't want them. I just want them to close their doors and fold. And I don't actually want to help them. What I am interested in is actually, because they'll just do something, they'll co-opt something and do it badly, and claim it's movement building, claim it's racial justice, and it's really just diversity, that has bad politics. So I would say that there are a range of organizations that are also doing work that are queer organizations that are, either multiracial or led by people of color across the country that are doing this work. And I happen to, been staff at Queer Economic Justice and still involved in the organization, is one. So, QEJ works around, in New York City, around housing and homelessness and around welfare and how it impacts queer folks, right? And we don't, we hear a lot about, or maybe in some places you hear a lot about queer youth homelessness, which is true. That we, in New York City, anywhere from a third to half, some people say, of homeless youth in New York City identify as LGBT youth, right? And they're almost entirely black and brown. The national statistics around homeless queer youth are 25 to 40% of all homeless youth nationally identify as queer youth, disproportionately youth of color. That is a national crisis, right? That's a crisis for the queer community, but it's not at all constructed as one. At best, it's constructed as an argument around youth, but it also makes the assumption that okay, so if you're homeless at 17, then you're going to be an MBA student at Harvard at 21. And that doesn't, and not to say that people who are homeless don't have that intellectual capacity. That's not what I'm arguing. But I'm arguing that actually the structural homelessness at 17 means you're likely to be homeless at 25, 45, 65, right? at QEJ, we work in the shelter system in New York City, and our folks are, the adult shelter system is 18 and up, and we work with, our base is people who are 18 to 60 some odd, right? The whole gamut. So to say like QEJ is one, there's several others in New York City, Audrey Law Project, Fierce, Silver Law Project, you know, and in different parts of the country. There's Gender Just in Chicago, there's Women with a Vision in New Orleans, there's Transgender, Gender Variant and Intersex Justice Project in California. It does work with trans women in either who have been in prison or in the prison system currently. And a number of other organizations around the country. And most of us have kind of, through Southerners on New Ground, right, which is doing regional work in the South, a number of us have gotten to know each other and worked together pretty closely over the last several years, and are working to try to build strategically how do we sort of do work, engage the sort of national mainstream stuff when it's necessary or it's strategic for us, right? But then also how do we build another movement of other work happening, you know, and also not just with us as organizations, but many of us have other relationships, right? I was staff at CR, so I, you know, kind of know a lot of the folks in the criminal justice. I also come from a long time of doing HIV/AIDS work, so I have a lot of kind of hands in HIV prevention policy stuff as well. So how am I bringing these politics to those spaces? How am I, you know, helping to move and helping to bring resources or whatever that come from those spaces to this other work, right? So there are organizations that exist that are doing this work in spite of what the kind of national organizations do, but we're doing it with like far less money and resources, and you know, are just scrappy as hell and trying to make it happen.
I'm just wondering, what do you see as the greatest impediment to LGBT equality in communities of color?
Actually, quite frankly, I mean, this is going to sound, I don't know how it's going to sound, but I actually think for me and what I feel like I see, the biggest impediment is actually the mainstream movement I'm discussing. It's not that, like, and it's, I think there's this idea specifically around black folks that black people are more homophobic than everybody else, right? And which I just kind of outhandedly reject, right? I grew up in the projects in Cleveland, Ohio, and there were queer people, trans people around. My mother was like, my Uncle Roger, you know, my mother's best friend, right? Come over any given Friday and Saturday in full drag, and they would go to the local bar in the early 80s. And not the gay bar, the local bar, just whatever. And there's a range of different ways. That is not to say there isn't homophobia in the black community, certainly. But to suggest that somehow the black community is like so politically backwards, which is usually what the argument suggests, is problematic. And also doesn't recognize a range of different work that black folks have been doing for decades, right, around the issue in the black community. So I would say that. The other thing, really, why I feel like the national movement is the problem is what it has done is it has helped solidify a notion that to be queer and a person of color is to be white, or to be white identified. It has solidified the idea that we're all running around fighting for the right to get up in a Vera Wang on any given Sunday in June, when my family is like, really? Like, I mean, now they get it because they like, you know, because they know the work I do, so my family's been exposed to a broader range of queer politics. And my family's pretty political, right? They're, you know, but they were like, really? Like marriage? Like, what kind of movement is that? Like, my grandparents' generation were like civil rights, I mean, like desegregation. So my mother was in the Black Panther Party in Cleveland. They're like, marriage? They don't, like, even so among black folks I have experienced who have political alignment with queer politics don't get those issues as, you know, they might agree that, like, yeah, people shouldn't be discriminated discriminated is what they don't understand, like, why that's the issue. And so then I have to kind of break it down. So I think that's part of the problem. And the other part of the problem is that I think that actually the LGBT movement, where it has attempted to do some kind of like racial justice, blah, 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 it has done it in the context of like, they always trying to find a black minister or Latino minister. I mean, that's like all the strategies to like work from like the faith-based place. And I don't say that that's like wrong, but I just think that, well, I don't say that it's wrong in and of itself. But I think that if your only strategy is to work just with black churches, which have a whole complicated history with dealing with sexuality anyway, because they're churches, like, is ridiculous to me. And then half the black community don't go to church, right? And have a whole critique about the kind of mega church and the kind of capitalist way in which like a lot of Christianity, not just black churches, have kind of like moved to this like the Lord then blessed me with this McMansion and this, Benz or whatever. Like really? Okay. So like so that's been the only place in which they will work or have tried to strategically work with the black community, that actually people in the black community who would be better allies to queer stuff are not at all taken into consideration. I mean, look at yesterday, this ad that went up in New York City that's now national news from this like, anti-abortion group that is a picture of this like, 67-year-old black girl on this huge billboard wherein it says the most dangerous place in the African-American community is in the womb.
If I can just follow up very quickly.
Excuse me.
I think you're right that maybe the mainstream movement, which, I hesitate to call it an agenda because no one sent me a flyer. But the way that the LGBT community has been constructed, as you said earlier, white, male, I mean, I even bristle at being called gay. I don't identify as gay, I'm not a man. White, male, upper class, materialistic, all of that. That also leaves out women who form a huge portion of this community and do an awful lot of the groundwork. So I don't know that I have a question.
Yeah, I mean, QEJ's, make no mistake, I mean, QEJ's base are mostly like queer women of color. That's who's in the shelter. Well, it's not just because there's a lot of gay men in the shelter system too, and we're having to try to figure out, but the male shelter is actually harder, they're more homophobic and harder for us to get into. We need more access to the women's shelters. But QEJ also started largely because of the Welfare Reform Act of '97. In New York City, we were seeing that like the welfare reform, I'll talk more about this tonight, the economy stuff will change you, but like when welfare reform was enacted, in '96, it added all this money and stuff to marriage promotion, right, and also made women who wanted to get access to welfare have to identify a biological father on the birth certificate. So if the caseworkers are then coming to your house, right, as they do if you have welfare to determine if you look poor enough to get, $200 a month or some crap like that, like, what was happening and still happens is that a lot of, queer women who are in relationships where their children were getting tanning, the non-biological, there's an assumption that if they find out, because of all this marriage promotion, identifying the dad and the birth and all this stuff, that there's an assumption that if they find out we're lesbians, we're going to get our benefits taken away. And so the non-biological partner ends up in the shelter system in New York in order to protect the welfare of the family. That we still see, welfare reform was '96, and we meet people in shelters every day for that reason. So, yeah, to say that like, right, that the impact of the work in terms of gender where women particularly are concerned is obviously very real.
We'll take two more.
Could you talk a little bit about the log cabin Republican Party and the cognitive dissonance required to belong in their place in the national conversation?
Right. So, like Log Cabin and Go Proud and, I mean, there's some dissonance, I think, in the sense that, like, obviously, well, maybe there's not dissonance, let me say it this way, that, like, the Republican Party, as a party, this is different from, like, the party itself is slightly different from the Christian conservative base that it manipulates and uses, right? That's very clear, and it's been documented, right? I mean, it was, anyway, so that, but to say that, like, okay, so, and there are clearly ways in which, like, you find out, I mean, it's like every year, you find out behind closed doors, all these Republicans, like all these gay Republicans, running stuff, right, in major ways. Rick Santorum's communications director was a black gay man. I go down the list. In any case, so I think that actually, what the gay Republicans sort of go proud and the log cabin Republicans, I think what they agree mostly on are, they agree on the kind of economic stuff, right? So they're neoliberals in that sense of like the way in which they see social policy and have an investment in a certain kind of like neoliberal capitalist model, right? Because for that reason, they see their interests monetarily, right, and economically for the Republican Party. And so then the differences around, you know, who one sleeps with or whatever, just they obviously feel less important to them than what they feel like is their sort of bottom line. So I don't know that I would necessarily describe it as dissonance, as like a kind of a political, we see our economic interests with this party, and we'll try to negotiate and move some of the kind of, you know, LGBT stuff in whatever ways we can, but we're not going to break from it because our bottom line is our bottom line. That's how I see it.
Can you talk about your identity? You were introduced as queer, and I'm just curious about how your identity relates to the politics that you've been talking about.
Sure. I mean, I sort of, I use queer and like gay, for myself personally, somewhat interchangeably. I mean, I think I'm politically queer and kind of culturally black gay. I feel like that about it. I mean, I feel like queer in the sense that, like, politically, you know, queer politics, which I think are looking at questions that are larger than just sexual orientation and gender identity, exclusive and in and of themselves. I think kind of queer politics thinks about those identities in relationship to the state, right? And how, and actually some kind of allowing for fluidity, for which even like kind of identities don't always describe how people actually like live and function, right? Like that, you know, there's a range of different ways people kind of use gender, use sexuality, the way that plays out. You know, it's like different. So I feel like queer politics I'm interested in for that reason. And I think, like, I mean, culturally, like, I mean, I came out in a black gay community in a very specific time and place. Like, I'm like old school, I'm a old school house head, and like, you know, I was never like in a house, like in the house of ball Logan community, but you know, but I sort of, yes, but I, you know, but I hang with the kids, you know, you know, I have a certain kind of like cultural rooting in those spaces. That is one thing, you know, it's like another thing. So, yeah, that's how I think about my identity.
All right, Kenyon, thank you so much. We look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you.